Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be forging a utility knife out of this old 5160 scrap blade that I'd forged a while ago. So let's throw it in the forge and get working. So one important thing to keep track of when forging out plates and bars is to control your mushrooming. So I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on camera, it's going to focus. You can kind of see, as I'm forging that down, you can kind of see how it's thicker on the edge where I'm hammering. And that's called mushrooming. So what you want to do is, as you're beating that down, switch it on its side and flatten it out. Otherwise, if you don't manage that, it's going to be awful. You're going to have foldovers and stuff. It's just, in general, going to negatively impact your forging across the board. That's always something to keep in mind when forging with plates, especially when you're hammering down onto it. But as long as you keep on top of it during the forging, it shouldn't be a problem. So I should probably explain what I'm doing here with this part. Is I'm forging this out. Basically, it's going to be a long, thin bar, roughly the length of my anvil. Once it's complete, so I'll beat it out from here to here. That'll be just one big thin bar, and that will become the handle. So as you can see, there's the blade, and it comes down pretty thin, and then that's just wrapped around to make the handle. So yeah, that's what I'm doing, and I guess that's what you're watching. So hope you enjoy. So often throughout the forging process, you'll see me, when I'm working on the anvil, spin my hammer around. When I pick it up, I'll check what side I'm working with. That's actually because on this hammer, I have two faces, basically. So one face, I've rounded it off a bit more. What that does is focus, basically. So when you swing and you impact the metal, with that rounded section there, it's not like a ball, but it is, I'll move so it can be seen, you know, not perfectly flat, it is rounded, and what that does is focus more of the energy into the center of the hammer, so that when I have stock on the anvil and I hit it, it deforms the metal a lot more, which is the side I use for most general work. On the other side is, I don't know how well this is going to show up on camera, but it's more flat. The edges aren't as rounded and curved as this side, and that side is what I use. So if I bring something down to size, or I want to flatten something out, or if it has a bend in it from just general forge work, I'll switch over to the flatter side and hit square against the anvil to forge basically a flatter surface. Now obviously this isn't a flattening hammer or not even the hammer I use for like final flattening passes. I have a separate one for that. But just in the general work process, I use the more rounded side for heavier work and deformation, and then I'll switch to the flatter side just to clean up the work basically. So if you're wondering why you see me switch my hammerhead, that's the reason. Now something to keep in mind when you're forging is the profile of the impact face on your hammer. So, like you can see here, I've got the rounded edge down, and that's what I'm working to beat the metal into shape. And then once I'm happy with the size, I switch to the other side and just do a general light flattening pass just to clean up the faces and straighten out the work. Now some of you may be wondering, when I'm forging, drawing this, the tang out, why I'm not either using my cross peen that I have up here to basically put a bunch of indentations, switch it around and forge it flat, or I'm not using the edge of my anvil to essentially put notches in it and then draw it out flat. And the reason for that is I don't want to put a bunch of steps in the blade, in the tang rather. So what I do generally when forging this type of blade is I'll hammer out the tang till it's roughly the length of my anvil, just because that gives me roughly the right size to make a decent handle for my hand at least. And just with putting a bunch of steps in there, like sure, I can notch it down there and forge that out, then that might not be long enough. So then I'd have to put, another step in, forge it down and out. And I just don't like doing that process. It can be rather time consuming. So I'll forge it out roughly the length, then I'll start notching it on the anvil or with my cross peen. Just depends on how I feel. So if you're wondering that, that's the answer to why. So now I'll be switching to my general work hammer. It has a lot smaller face than the club hammer I was using before. And I'm just going to use this for beating out the tang, forging in the tang. Not the final pass, but definitely approaching it. Just because it's a smaller strike face, allows me to do more precise work and makes it a lot easier for drawing it out when it gets thinner rather than just compressing the stock. so as you can kind of see, I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on the camera, but that tang is the right size now, maybe just a bit shy, but just with a bit more general work, it'll come out to size. So now I'm going to work on taking the stock down to the final thickness that I want for the blade section, and then I'll cut it off from the rest of the stock and start working on the blade. So I've decided I'm gonna, this is still a bit thicker than the final blade length, but I'm gonna cut it off, isolate the rest of the stock and start working on the blade now. So next heat I'll grab my hot cut and make that happen. So unfortunately my camera died while I was doing the hot cut, so I don't think that footage is going to be around. But as you can see here, I've hot cut the rest of the stock off. Now I'm going to start working on forging out the blade and basically using the tang, twisting it into a handle. So what I've done is, hold on, I'll spin the blade around. I've forged out the blade shape. What I'm doing now is just thinning down some more of the tang so that it's all one thickness, and then I'll get on to the next steps. So next I'm going to curve the tang around and form the handle for this blade, and to do that I'm going to be using the horn on my anvil, as is typical for most forming work of that nature. I could also use a jig that you put in the hardy hole, basically has two poles, and use that to twist things. However, I haven't made one, and I don't really have much of a use for it. So, yeah. Alright, so that's the blade forged. Typically, on a lot of my other knives, in fact, I'll go grab one now to show you. So, this is a cookery that I've made, and typically what I like to do with the edge bevel is forge it out on the anvil, rather than having it flat like this. As you can see, there's no bevel. I'm going to be grinding the blade on there. Typically, I like to forge in the bevel, which I did on this one and a lot of my larger blades. But just because of the size and the thickness of it, I'm just going to be bringing it in by hand with my files and sanding. But before I do that, I'm going to anneal the blade. So I'm going to sit it in the forge, and once it's up to heat, what I'm going to do is I have a tub of charcoal powder, and I'm just going to sit it in there and let it cool down in there. The carbon will act as an insulator and slow down the cooling, which will hopefully normalize the blade and make it a lot softer for me to work with. However, just before that, I've noticed that the blade itself isn't quite straight, so I'm just going to quickly fix that up on the anvil. So just like I said before, I'm going to bring the blade up probably to about 1,000, maybe 1,100 degrees, which will be like a sort of really orangey yellow color. And then I'm going to let it cool down slowly in the charcoal tub that I have. And I will join you once that is done. So, I've just gotten back. The knife has cooled down, I can handle it now. That's what it looks like. So now what I'm going to do is start filing. So the first thing I like to do when filing a knife is to just flatten out the spine, and then also the blade edge, flatten that out so that when I grind in the bevel, it's consistent straight edge. You don't have any wobbles or ripples or anything just from the forging. Then typically I'd file down the sides. However, due to the nature of this knife just being like a utility knife, nothing special, I'm not going to worry about doing up the sides. I'll probably descale them and everything, but I'm just going to grind in the bevel because there's no real point to doing any finishing work on the cheeks of the blade. It's once again just for work, and it'll end up similar to this, although this one I have gone over with a bit of sandpaper. I have another one here, so you can see I've only really, this isn't finished, but I've only filed and sand the blade, the bevel, not worrying about the cheeks. So yeah, let's get started. So I've got all my files here. What I'm going to start off with is this pretty big, I think it's 250mm second cut bastard file. It's big, got a lot of cutting space to it, and that's what I'm going to use just to start off with. Because it's a bastard cut file, it does leave a very noticeable file marks in it. However, I have a very fine second cut Nicholson file, as well as a single cut file, which I use more like a draw knife than anything, just working back and forward to polish it out. So that's what I'll be doing. Now, there are two important things to keep in mind when working with hand files. The first is to brush out the file. So every now and again, when I notice that there's something caught in the teeth, I like to just take a wire brush. If I had a file card, I'd use that, but just brush it out in the same direction, angle rather, as the teeth, to match the grooves, just to make sure that there isn't anything caught in there. Brush out all the chips and filings. Helps to just improve the finish, as well as makes the file last longer. And the second thing is to not back file. So you'll notice when I'm filing, I'll file and then lift it and come back. That's because the teeth are designed to cut going that direction. Now, there's a bit of a debate on whether it does affect the file or not when you back file. That is, you put pressure down forward and then going back. Some people say that it doesn't really matter. Other people say to never do it. I'm in the camp that you shouldn't back file, because if you think about it, you're cutting that way and the teeth are sharp in that direction. So if you're looking at the file, the teeth come up, and so they're designed to cut going forward. But then if you back file, what ends up happening is you end up rounding down the top of the tooth. And also, if you have any chips and debris in there, when you back file, it can fold the tooth inwards and basically trap whatever's in there into that groove, and you're not going to get it out easily. So, not a major point, but it is always good to keep in mind proper filing techniques when, especially with metal. With wood, not so much, but especially with metal, it's good to keep these things in mind. So now that I've done the rough filing on the spine of the blade, I'm just going to do a quick pass with the Nicholson file. It's a lot finer than the bastard cut. That'll just kind of, if there's any deep gouges from debris and swarf being pushed along by the file, this will kind of neaten it up before I go over it with the single cut. Alright, so now I'm going to take my single cut and just basically put a decent finish on the spine. So now that I've finished on the spine, I'm basically just going to repeat the same process for what will be the blade edge. Just keeping in mind that I want to keep the profile of the blade. So that's something to keep in mind when filing your blade edge, is just don't go too wild and keep in mind what you want the finished blade to look like. To start off, I'm going to file down the tip, just so that I don't have a bald or rough section where the tip of the blade will be. Now I'm not going to worry about putting a finish on the blade edge like I did on the spine, mainly because basically all that edge there is going to end up filed away as I file in the bevel. So what I will do before is take my Nicholson file, the finer double cut, and just put about a 45-degree chamfer just on the spine and then also on the blade edge. Now, as you can imagine, it's fairly difficult, especially with this style of handle, to clamp the knife horizontally so that I can work in the blade edge bevel, and clamping it vertically, it presents the same problem. It's very difficult to actually grind in the edge. So what I have is just some wood, which I've screwed on a bit there. Open up my vise, throw it in, make sure it's nice and tight, and then lay the blade on there and have some G clamps, or C clamps rather, which I then use to hold down. When positioning it, I like to get the blade edge as close to the edge of the wood as reasonably possible, just so that I'm not trying to work at that angle and I can't reach the blade because the wood's in the way. So what I do is I kind of bring it up to the edge and then clamp it down in that position. Now obviously you can buy or make a knife maker's vise. It is on my list of things to do, but I just haven't gotten around to it yet, and this solution works. So I found my rat tail file. What I'm going to use this for is to establish the plunge lines and the bevel angle and depth, cut depth and everything. So I'll go ahead and do this on one side and then flip it over, do it on the other, and come back to this side and start filing down the bevel. So now that I have the plunge lines established and I've kind of set the angle for the bevel and everything, I'm just going to file down the blade until it's at the right shape. I won't film that whole process because it's not going to be very interesting. It's just going to be more and more of the same. However, I will cut back if I have anything of note to bring up. So I've filed in the edge on this knife. What I'm doing is using my single cut file, going across just to make sure the bevel is flat and consistent across the whole blade. And I've got my forge preheating in the background for the hardening process. So I'll finish evening out the bevel and then we'll take it over and harden the blade. Alright, so just before I take it to the forge for the normalizing heat, I'm just going to redo that chamfer on the back, make sure it's nice and uniform across the whole spine, including the tip, because that's lost a bit of material from putting the blade on. Now, if this wasn't just a workshop knife, I'd sand down and polish the blade before I heat treat it. But seeing as this is just going to be used in the workshop for carving out sheaths. So, as you can see here, I finished filing in the bevel and straightening out the blade. The camera won't focus for some reason. Now, if this was going to be like for a client or sold or for anything literally other than just another workshop knife, I would probably do all the polishing work before heat treating. However, I'm not going to worry about doing any of that just because it's for personal use around the workshop. So I'll basically just quench it and then hit it with some sandpaper, rough grit down to fine grit, just to neaten it up after quenching, and then that will be the blade finished. Let's get ready for heat treating. So coincidentally, it's night time by the time I actually finish this, and I actually do prefer doing my heat treat work at night or without any background sunlight, as it allows me to see the heat colors of the steel a lot easier. Just makes heat treating easy because I can more easily see what temperature the steel is at. This being 5160 spring steel, it's quenched in water at roughly, I believe, 850 to 860 degrees Celsius, which is about a cherry red color. And typically I wouldn't heat treat a blade on an open forge. I'd get a fire brick across the top and basically turn the forge into a small oven. But given that the blade is fairly small, I won't need to do that. It'll heat fairly evenly with just the regular forge. So I'll be back when it's time to quench. So the blade is approaching its quench temperature. Just flipping it around to make sure it's heated evenly on both sides. Because if you don't heat it evenly, it can cause warping in the blade. Just sort of managing the firebox there, making sure it's all evenly heated. Now on the camera it's showing up as basically like white, but it is at about a cherry red currently. Just sort of making sure it's evenly heated. Alright, yep. Time to quench. Just going to orient it in the tongs correctly. It's important that when you quench you agitate the blade vertically up and down to prevent basically air bubbles forming against the blade, which will cause it to warp. As you can see, I don't think, yeah, no, it hasn't warped in the quench, which I'm happy about. I'm going to hit it with a bit of sandpaper and see if there's any cracks along the blade, but hopefully there shouldn't be. And after that, I'll temper it. I'll get back to you when it is time. So I've just hit the blade edge with some 120 grit sandpaper, and I don't know if it's going to show up or focus, but there's been no cracking or warping in the blade, which I'm very happy about. Cuts well. If I just take a nick, this might not work just given the angle, but yeah, it does cut. It does cut, trust me. It's just that holding the camera and having to work at weird angles makes it a bit more difficult. But I'm going to take it back to the forge and temper it to a nice straw yellow, which is about 150 degrees Celsius, if memory serves me correctly. Now, when tempering, I like to heat from the spine to the blade, or basically rest the spine against the coals and let it temper that way. So I'm just going to temper it, put the camera down, and then come back once that's done. Alright, so I've tempered the blade. Came up a nice straw yellow. Once again, don't think the camera's going to show it all that well. And I just hit the edge bit on my whetstone. It's now very sharp. Yeah, so that's how I forge these utility knives, blacksmith knives, I've heard some people call them. I do plan on making slightly better filmed and more informative forge content in the future, so if you're interested in seeing that, I guess subscribe to see when I release it. Otherwise, have a good day, and thank you for your time.